Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to today's session to discuss the establishment of the National Strategy for Volunteering. My name is Sue Regan. I'm Deputy CEO and Policy Director here at Volunteering Australia. I would like to start by acknowledging and celebrating the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I'm here in the ACT on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who have joined us today. The National Strategy for Volunteering recognises that community giving has been taking place in First Nations communities for tens of thousands of years. The National Strategy builds on this enduring contribution of First Nations peoples, and we celebrate the power of volunteering, the power of community giving to promote reconciliation. So today we are here to update you and discuss the first year establishment phase of the National Strategy for Volunteering. My job now is simply to hand you over to the safe hands of Zach Ryman, who many of you will know and is the National Strategy Director at Volunteering Australia, who will get the session started. Over to you, Zach.
Thank you very much, Sue. I'm coming to you today from Yuggera and Turrbal Land up here in southeast Queensland. And thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Really appreciate your time today as we discuss the establishment of the National Strategy for Volunteering in Australia. So to start things off, I would like to start with a recap of the National Strategy and its core tenets, its core uses, and a bit about how it came about as well. So what is the National Strategy? It's a 10-year blueprint. And as you can see in the image, the National Strategy for Volunteering runs from 2023 to 2033. It's a national strategic framework to guide the actions needed to achieve a better future for volunteering. And it provides a clear, compelling case for change, underpinned by robust data and evidence. If you look through the National Strategy document itself, as I'm sure many of you have, you will see weaved throughout this baseline research and evidence that informs many of the facets of the National Strategy. Another thing that informed the decisions made in the development of the National Strategy was input from all of you, people across the volunteering ecosystem, volunteer involving organisations, small community groups, large charities, individual volunteers, researchers, and anyone else who's involved, peak bodies, supporting groups, and government, for example. So thank you so much to those who did contribute during that process, for anyone who's had an interest or support for the National Strategy going forward, and those who are just joining us for the first time. We welcome you and we're glad to see you. So part of today's session is we're going to be hearing from you. So we're going to be asking questions throughout. I hope you're ready to give us some feedback, share your thoughts. Now, if you're using this through Teams, there will be a poll, a series of polls coming up through the presentations. It'll look different for you depending whether you're on a phone, whether you're on a computer. You might see a pop-up, you might see a tab like the chat tab on the side, or you might have a poll button that appears. So as we're talking about what is the National Strategy, we'd like to start things off with a question, which is, how familiar are you with the National Strategy for Volunteering? So I'd like to pick between these options. In a moment or two, you should see a poll pop up for you. The options are very familiar, somewhat familiar, slightly familiar, or not at all. So we encourage you either through the pop-up or the polls tab to pick an option that best describes your position, your understanding, and click submit. And we should have some results coming up as well. And thank you for those who've already filled it out. Wow, 90 people, quick off the ball. So it's creeping up. And so we can see here in this room, which we would expect to be a room that is in general more familiar with the National Strategy, we have about half of the room saying that they're somewhat familiar, hovering around 17, 18% very familiar. So it's basically 2/3 are somewhat or very familiar, 1/3 are slightly familiar or not at all. So it goes to show a few things. It goes to show that there is a highly aware, highly engaged group of people concerning the National Strategy for Volunteering. It also goes to show that even in a room like this, even in a topic, an event that is based around discussions on the National Strategy for Volunteering, there are still people putting their hand up saying, I'd like to know more about it. I don't really feel that familiar with it. So no matter where we are, there's room to grow. And an interesting thing is that we asked this question earlier this year, and we heard back from 190 people in our consultation, asking them the same question: how familiar are you with the National Strategy for Volunteering? And we got similar responses in that consultation, that survey of 190 people. Same result, about roughly 2/3 were somewhat or very familiar, roughly 1/3 were slightly familiar or not at all familiar. So interesting to see that result replicated here today. And I just see in the chat a few people having audio issues. I'll just ask for confirmation that we can hear, and thank you for those who are chiming in, volunteering to support their fellow attendees. Really appreciate that. Thank you. So thank you for contributing that info. We'll ask you a few more questions throughout, so get used to seeing that pop up as well. Okay, so back to what is the National Strategy for Volunteering. Based on the discussions, the research, the consultations, the workshops, the contributions of the design team, during the development of the National Strategy, a core vision was conceived. And this is that volunteering is the heart of Australian communities. This is the vision that is itself at the heart of the National Strategy. You can think of it as the overarching goal that everything else falls under. Because volunteering is such a broad and complex landscape, there are several sub-themes in here that complement that vision and expand upon it. So volunteering is the heart of Australian communities, where more people volunteer more often, where volunteers feel respected, then their contribution makes a difference, where volunteering is valued and properly considered in policy settings, where diversity in volunteering is recognised, celebrated and supported, where people individually and collectively realise their potential. And I'm sure these ideas, these themes are relevant for many of us in this room and the experiences that we've had within volunteering. So how do we pursue that vision? How do we achieve that vision? Well, the National Strategy is broken down into a few areas to make it more tangible, make it more accessible. One category is by focus area. So there are 3 focus areas within the National Strategy that strategic objectives fall under, and these align with the visions that we saw earlier. So the focus areas of individual potential in the volunteer experience, the second focus area, community and social impact, and the third, conditions for volunteering to thrive. Within those focus areas, there are 11 strategic objectives that provide more detail, and each one is expanded upon within the document itself with a page or 2 of supporting research, some explanation around the decisions that led to that strategic objectives, and some more information to aid you in using these strategic objectives to further your volunteering, your engagement of volunteers. There's also the establishment phase. So the establishment phase is an important part of the National Strategy 10-year plan. There is action happening in the meantime, but there's also the establishment phase, which is the first phase of implementation. So during the establishment phase, it lays the foundations for the rest of the 10-year strategy, while in the meantime, pursuing action towards the strategic objectives, the 11 mentioned earlier, and the vision. So let's talk a bit more about the establishment phase, which is the key topic of our webinar today. So you can see a rough timeline there on the left. In January 2022, the National Strategy project kicked off. There was obviously work in the past and a previous national strategy in years gone by. But for this national strategy, January 2022, and then in February of this year, the national strategy was launched, and we're currently in the establishment phase, which will run until July next year. And the years of the national strategy will be, you can think of them as being aligned with the financial year from that point on. And then the first 3-year action plan will kick in July 2024. But in this phase, the establishment phase, it's a first year of the 10-year national strategy. So there's a special focus here, which is to build support for the national strategy, to help others engage with the strategy, to use it to further their work, to embed the national strategy as a core document within volunteering. What do we mean by this? We mean that the national strategy for volunteering could be reflected in policy decisions made, for example, by different levels of government. It could be embedded within other frameworks. It could be aligned with other strategies. It could serve as a foundation for a strategy in the future. All of these things are ways to embed the national strategy as a core document. Many of you will be familiar with the national standards for volunteer involvement. We can think of the national strategy for volunteering in a similar light, where it's a core document at the heart of volunteering, focus on strategic objectives and the future. Also, during this establishment phase, we work collaboratively to design these 4 deliverables that you'll find within the strategy document itself. There's the governance blueprint, the model for shared accountability, the 3-year action plan, and the monitoring and evaluation framework. But those are titles that can maybe be a bit formal for some discussions. We can think of it as, what questions do these items help us answer? So the governance blueprint is the national strategy happening? Is it being progressed to a high standard? Is it on track? Are all the processes appropriate? The model for shared accountability will be, who should do what? What is appropriate for people to contribute? How do people want to contribute? These are what we're trying to identify there. The 3-year action plan, or the first 3-year action plan. What happens? What are we doing? What are people throughout the volunteering ecosystem doing or being encouraged to do? The monitoring and evaluation framework. What is the impact? Is it happening? How can we assess the value and the outcomes of the national strategy for volunteering? So these are important things that we will be delivering with your help, with your collaboration. You can see there, the second point is about helping others to use the strategy. So I've got another question coming up for you. And some of you may remember this if you were engaged in a survey of ours earlier in the year. But the question is about what would help you the most to learn about the national strategy for volunteering and how to achieve its goals. And we have a few options there. I'm going to read them out loud just in case anyone has trouble seeing them at this font height, which is written guides or templates, support within my organization. For example, you might be someone who has a role that includes management of volunteers, and you may want to convince your organization leadership that the national strategy is worth supporting. Support within my sector. This could be if you're a group that engages volunteers or is adjacent to volunteering, but you also belong to another area of work as well. For example, sport, health, arts, it could be veterans affairs, youth, education, this type of thing. So do you need more support within your sector? Do you need events and workshops, online tools, videos, or you're also welcome to say that you do not need any additional support? And let's see what people have answered here. Written guides or templates is a top response. Events and workshops and online tools. It's a bit like watching a race or watching an event. You can see some creeping up faster than others. But in fact, these top responses, written guides or templates, events and workshops, and online tools that we're seeing here from this audience, these are the same top 3 results that we saw earlier in the year when we asked and we heard back from 189 people at that time. So those were the top results, and that has informed our plans to appropriately engage people in the national strategy and the establishment phase. And so I'm glad to have your feedback on this and to see that result confirmed with another audience. Of course, there will be some overlaps. Some people attending the session today would have previously given the answer earlier, but it's great to see it broken down like this. And someone has just commented, would love to be able to submit more than one. Yes, that's true. And in fact, in the survey we had early this year, in this section, you could include more than one answer. And so again, if you're having any issues with the poll, please feel free to put your thoughts in the chat. We will look at the poll results and the chat after this event and use that as part of our ongoing data collection through the establishment phase, as we hear from you and hear from people across the volunteering ecosystem as to what your thoughts are and how to best support you throughout the National Strategy for Volunteering. So thank you so much for contributing that to this. And this has informed the work that we are doing throughout this phase. So we currently have some draft guides and templates that are being progressed internally within Volunteering Australia. We're also looking at examples of others that have other resources that have been rolled out to support strategies. We are also looking at online tools, and we have started investigating solutions there. But of course, we need to continue hearing from people in order to tailor these to best support you, whatever your situation may be, respecting, of course, that there are people from all across volunteering, and that what works for one person or one organization, one group, may not be the best solution for someone else. So the key is to have multiple options and a flexible approach that is guided by consultation. And indeed, today, we have an online event, running it as almost a mini workshop in a way, where we want to hear from you, and this will be part of the approach going forward as well. So you can expect to see regular events and regular opportunities to participate and collaborate throughout the rest of the establishment phase. So thank you for your input. It'll continue to guide our approach going forward. So although we can see here the establishment phase in the perspective of the 10 years is this section at the start, followed by three-year action plans that make up the remaining 9 years. There are important things to do during this phase, and although the action plans come later, that does not mean that action is not happening within this time. So it's also a time of action to progress the national strategy and its vision. Lots of groups, lots of organizations, lots of individuals have been progressing the national strategy in their own way, and we're always really glad to hear about that, and we celebrate it. And there are others that are working with us to progress the national strategy in their own way within their sector and within their organization. I want to share just a little bit of an update of what we've been doing internally as well, the National Strategy for Volunteering team within Volunteering Australia. You'll be familiar with Sarah Wilson, who is currently on a period of leave, but will be expected to come back, and you'll see Sarah and see the results of her great work coming up soon. We also have Lubna, who's joined the team, who you might see in the chat in this session, pointing you towards the website and encouraging you to write to us. And of course, we have others in the session as well. We have Kylie and Jack and others in the Volunteering Australia team. So we've been consulting the volunteering ecosystem. Thank you to those who have already given us your time and met up with us. We've been pursuing research. You may recall the launch of the third tranche of the volunteering research papers. Thank you to those who attended that event. We shared it again in the most recent subscriber update. And of course, you can always find all the research that's come out alongside the national strategy on the research page on the strategy website. We've also been attending conferences and events to represent the national strategy for volunteering. Some of the major events have been events in sport and also within the emergency management and disaster response sector. So thank you for those who have engaged with us through that. And we've been planning the future engagement throughout the establishment phase and leading up to the time beyond. But it's also key to remember that that's what Volunteering Australia have been doing, but it's not Volunteering Australia's owned strategy. The National Strategy for Volunteering is owned collectively by the volunteering ecosystem in Australia. We have a role to play in centralized coordination and in support. I like to think of our role as being we're cheerleaders. We celebrate what you're doing. We're here to listen. We're here to collaborate. We're here to guide. But also, we're not here to be gatekeepers. So many have taken up the national strategy and started pursuing it and progressing it in a way that is appropriate for them. And that is fantastic. And I'd just like to highlight a few examples of the action that has taken place in the months since the national strategy has come out. So if we look at the National Volunteering Guide from Justice Connect, also known as not-for-profit law, depending which side you're approaching them from, I hope you are familiar with the National Volunteering Guide. It is an excellent document that cites a lot of legal precedent within Australia, broken down by states and territories, and different responsibilities and obligations and intersections of the law and volunteering, which I'm sure many of you recognize can be a very complicated topic at times. And so this guide provides legal guidance or guidance on legal obligations for volunteer involving organizations and indeed for volunteers themselves. And so if you look up the guide now, you'll see that it incorporates the National Strategy for Volunteering throughout. So you can see not just what are the legal obligations in this circumstance, but if we make a change or if we pursue best practice and make sure we're complying with all of our legal obligations, that we have the best, safest framework we can, how does this also align with the National Strategy for Volunteering? Because there will be lots of action that progresses the National Strategy for Volunteering that is also aligned with other projects, other scope of work. Not everything will be created out of the National Strategy by itself in isolation, because within volunteering, as we know, things are contributing to many causes at once. Even volunteers may join a volunteer involving organization to progress its mission, but there may be benefits for the volunteer as well that, in fact, for them are the highlight of the experience, getting to know the team, getting to share stories, getting to see the benefits of helping people through their volunteering. And so with all these things being interconnected, it's not unusual that you might want to consider your legal obligations and your future strategic goals at the same time. The National Strategy for Volunteering has also been cited in the National Volunteer Sustainability Blueprint, which is a proposed upcoming blueprint within the emergency management sector. And within the draft content on that blueprint that's been presented so far, they cite the National Strategy for Volunteering and cite alignment with the National Strategy as being one of the things underpinning this body of work. We also have strong collaboration between the National Strategy team and the Sport Volunteer Coalition. So the Sport Volunteer Coalition Action Plan, I mentioned the National Strategy Action Plan comes out next year, but there is an action plan for the Sport Volunteer Coalition, and it aligns with many of the strategic objectives in the National Strategy for Volunteering. So there's no surprise that there's been strong partnership there between Volunteering Australia, between other people involved in National Strategy, and the Sport Volunteer Coalition. We really thank them for that work. Another example I'd like to cite is Uniting Care Queensland. So I'm a Queensland local. I'm very familiar with Uniting Care Queensland, but for anyone who isn't, it's a major volunteer involving organisation. In different contexts, you may know them by different names, such as Blue Care, but they engage thousands of volunteers across the state and do some really amazing work. And they are using the national strategy to help measure volunteer impact, to set strategic goals, and to improve the volunteer experience. And in fact, to speak to this further, I would really like to introduce now DJ Cronin. Now, some of you may have met DJ or heard from DJ before, but I've invited DJ to share his perspective from Uniting Care Queensland on the National Strategy for Volunteering and how it's helping them align with their strategic goals. So thank you for joining us, DJ.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invite, Zach, and greetings from Quandamooka country, and good afternoon to you all.
Excellent. I just wanted to start by showing something, DJ, that you had shared with me, which was something you'd presented internally within Uniting Care. And I thought this was a really powerful statement, and I was so glad to see this when you shared it with us. You can see it there on the screen. I just wanted to ask you, why did you see it as important or valuable that Uniting Care Queensland uses the national strategy for volunteering internally on your approach to volunteer engagement?
Well, Zach, I think that the national strategy is a very powerful strategy in that it can be incorporated into organizational strategic plans, frameworks, reports, and even policies. I believe that the strategy's bold vision can be and should be your bold vision. We see the value as an organization of being able to do our work, stating we are aligning with the national strategy in all of the work that we do. Our own team, our volunteer experience team, has run its own internal workshops on the strategy for staff and volunteers, and have promoted it to all services at United Care, including Blue Care, Lifeline, our hospitals, etc.
Excellent. And yeah, like I said, this is one of those great examples of action happening. The action plan comes later, but that does not exclude the idea of action happening now. And one of the really useful things that you shared with us as well was throughout these documents that that we saw, you had highlighted some of the strategic objectives from the National Strategy for Volunteering, and also you'd set some objectives within Uniting Care Queensland yourself. I was just wondering, did you find the strategy useful when you were setting these objectives or considering them? And could you maybe talk us through the process of how you went about it?
Yeah, sure. Look, I was involved in the core design team of the strategy, so I knew at an early stage that this would have a really positive impact on the work that we do at Uniting Care. In terms of finding it useful, when you go down to some of the key points, I'll give you examples like individual potential and the volunteer experience. That volunteering is safe, inclusive, accessible, meaningful, and not exploitative. We've actually put into place strategies that incorporate all of that statement. We walk the walk. We changed our team's name from the volunteer management team to the volunteer experience team. I'm the volunteer experience manager because at the heart of volunteering must be a positive experience for all the volunteers and volunteering. I guess in terms of talking you through some of the processes that we've used the national strategy for, we just love the vision that volunteering is the heart of all our communities in Australia, where people volunteer more often. In fact, in 2019 we launched our own 2030 strategy that is very similar to the strategy that you have. This involved initiatives from all services, and one of our 3 volunteer initiatives is in fact called Growing the Volunteering Footprint, and is sponsored by Executive at Uniting Care. So our volunteer experience team was resourced to have 10 FTE with specialists in community engagement, corporate volunteering, project management. We are lucky enough to engage a media company to work on material to promote volunteering for us. And we launched our Volunteer to Change Lives, Yours Included campaign. And so by adopting a lot of, what's already in the strategy, it has led to volunteer growth within our organization. We looked at that powerful statement in the strategy where volunteering is valued and properly considered in policy setting, service design, and strategic investment. So in terms of how we align that with the national strategy, we co-designed our first volunteer engagement framework. Again, another initiative sponsored by our executive team. So that framework established the basic values, attitudes, and principles towards volunteering in Uniting Care and outlines our organization's commitment to investing in the effective management and inclusion of volunteers. So we've made that framework now to be aligning with the vision of the national strategy on volunteering. The application of that and the inclusion of the national strategy, I believe, is critical to ensure that any services engaging volunteers operate in accordance with not only our organization's mission and values, policy documents, and the national standards, but also now the framework. And this framework was also co-designed in consultation with other leaders, volunteer managers, employees, and volunteers. The other one that really stood out to us was where volunteers feel respected and know their contribution makes a difference. You know, it's very important to us that volunteer recognition. We established 2 categories in our organizational Full Circle and Reconciliation Awards, 2 new categories, which were volunteer categories. We have a volunteer newsletter, Hands Up, it's called. It goes to over 6,000 subscribed volunteers. And this year we are publishing our very first volunteer impact report with qualitative and quantitative data. And in that report itself, there's an acknowledgement of the new national strategy for volunteering. In our volunteering policy, it's an all-step policy which states that everyone at Uniting Care must respect volunteers and the contribution that they make. And I guess finally how it's really helped us frame what we want to do in our organization by using this fantastic national strategy is the point where diversity in volunteering is recognized, celebrated, and supported. And that's inspired us to take a number of actions. So we set up we are in the process of setting up a multicultural action plan for volunteering at Uniting Care. Uniting Care and the volunteering service is an ally of the LGBTIQ+ community, and we celebrate significant dates in the year and foster inclusion in that we welcome all to volunteer. We're also working with the Reconciliation Action Plan management team to ensure that we are culturally aware and the diversity and impact of volunteering is articulated and celebrated. We've also formed a youth consultant group to make sure we have the voice of youth involved in our design of volunteering programs, services, and of course, attracting Gen Z to volunteering because they are our future. So all of those things that we took from the national strategy, we were able to embed them into our frameworks, our policies, our plans, our strategic planning, our workshops. And we do workshops on the national strategy internally. And it has really helped us in terms of the language used around volunteering. And when, you know, most organizations, when we are, I guess, educating upwards to higher management, executive boards, whatever, we can really take parts of this national strategy and rather than just use them as words, we can convert them into action. And I hope that some of those examples of converting some of the national strategy into real action will encourage some of you to have a look at that. And I'm on LinkedIn. If anybody wants to connect with me there, I'm very happy to do so. But thank you, Zach.
Oh, no, thank you, DJ. And I do encourage people to get in touch with with DJ as well. I've always found it really useful to have a chat with you every now and again and bounce around some ideas. I do have one more question for you,
Yes,
DJ.
please, Zach.
And it's great to hear about all these examples. It sounds, just as you say, you hope that this serves as inspiration or motivation for someone else to have a look at this national strategy and think about how it could be incorporated into their engagement of volunteers, their volunteer experience. You mentioned as well a few times that these initiatives were supported by the executive in your organization. And so, you know, either we've got an executive that values volunteering, or you've done a really good job of communicating the idea, or both. I won't ask you to pick which one, but if you were to give a tip to someone who's approaching leadership within their organization and saying, hey, we should maybe have a look at this national strategy for volunteering, do you have a tip in mind of how to approach that?
Yeah, look, any of those initiatives that I've spoken about, we had to present business cases on all our initiatives, and it's you know, organizations say they value volunteers. But the reality is, you know, I do accept there are many volunteer-run organizations out there, and indeed, but members of volunteer-run organizations amongst our crowd in the webinar today. But if you're working with an organization where formal volunteering is happening, it's about having the courage to be able to present to your board or to present to your executive about national strategy and why it's important to the organization and why investment in the national strategy is very, very important. So we had to stand in front of executive on several occasions with presentations accompanied by papers. And, you know, the national strategy really resonated with executive because the language used and it's like, well, hey, it makes sense. We have 7,500 volunteers. If we're not aligning with the national strategy, then that is not good. So it's really important to put together some presentations, to look at your policies, to look at your framework. If you have a framework, I would recommend everybody have a framework of volunteering. And, you know, if you're thinking, what am I going to put into that framework? Just read the national strategy, pick out the parts that resonate with you. And, you know, there's some powerful language in there, and we've taken advantage of that powerful language. And I would encourage everybody else to do so.
Amazing. Thank you so much, DJ. Really appreciate your time today and sharing your experience of working with the national strategy.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and thank you, and greetings to everyone, and good luck with implementing the national strategy wherever you are in this beautiful country. Thank you.
Excellent. And so, as DJ mentioned, within Uniting Care Queensland, they do have access to some resources as well that support, you know, developing the business case for why we should support the national strategy for volunteering. And I don't imagine that every single group out there is in a similar position. I myself come from much smaller volunteer involving organizations in my past, but the key thing is, I think what DJ highlighted at the end there, have a look through the national strategy for volunteering, browse the strategic objectives and pick some parts that are most relevant for you and offer the most value for you. And if you look at those, they should in fact save you time in some of the work that you're doing going forward, setting goals, and looking at how to measure the impact of volunteering and some of your strategic outcomes. And so these examples on screen, these are just some of the examples I picked out from my discussions with DJ and Uniting Care. There were others besides, but really appreciate sharing that example. And speaking of which, we're continuously very pleased when we have a meeting with someone, we hear from someone, and they mention, oh yeah, we've just started a project that progresses the national strategy for volunteering, and we're using this part in this way. And that's often news to us, and we're so glad to hear it. And we don't imagine that we are aware of every use of the national strategy out there because there are so many. But I'd like to ask you to share if you've used the national strategy in your work or if you know of any other examples, and to put these in the chat. And so some things we can think of: the national strategy in action. So the national strategy, it's available to help you set strategic goals, develop new initiatives, or make the case for investment. And like I mentioned, we'd like to ask you here and now, put in the chat, have you used the national strategy in your work? What other examples have you seen? And while people are just typing out something, I'd like to invite Jack from Volunteering Australia as well. So Jack has been a key part of the development of the national strategy, especially in the research side of things. But Jack also has an important role working on policy submissions, looking at what the federal government is doing, stuff like that. And so there are parts of Volunteering Australia that I'm not part of myself. They're outside the national strategy team, but they use the national strategy in their work. So Jack, I was wondering if you could just tell us, how have you found using the national strategy in, say, policy submissions?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. So I thought I'd just talk very briefly about how we use strategy in mostly our policy work at VA, which is a lot of what we do. So in all of our policy submissions since the strategy, and there has been quite a lot of national policy reform happening this year, a lot of which intersects with volunteering. So it's been quite timely, really. But so we will include a dedicated section on the national strategy that highlights how our recommendations align with the strategic objectives of the strategy. So, for example, anything that we recommend, across portfolio on investment in volunteering pulls a lot from the purpose and themes and research and expertise in strategic objective 3.3, commit to strategic investment. We kind of look through the objectives of the strategy and align our work or draw on it as a source of direction for submissions. And so that's kind of made sure not just that we can align what we do with the strategy, but also we have access to this expertise and experience and research and the voice of the volunteering ecosystem in the strategy that we can draw upon to guide our recommendations as well. So that's been quite a valuable change, I think, to our policy work at VA.
Fantastic, thank you. And there's been a real outpouring of examples in the chat as well. And all of these point towards the national strategy being a living, breathing thing. The national strategy is a fantastic document, but that's not all it is. And it should not be just a piece of paper that is nice to print out and put on the shelf. It should be a living, breathing strategy embedded within volunteering that puts volunteering at the heart of Australian communities. So just to highlight some of the examples we have coming in the chat here, I've got to scroll a long way up. There's so many coming through. So Jane says that their organisation is working on a new volunteer program using the national strategy. Remain says it's used in volunteer recognition. May says an outcome measurement framework at St Vincent de Paul in WA. Sue says strategy for 2 not-for-profits and the national standards. Elston says using it within Scouts Australia on a strategic plan. Duke of Edinburgh, 62,000 volunteers annually. And growing to 120,000. Wow. Deb says they're using it at MND Victoria. Lauren says yes. This is excellent. And so I've skipped about half of them there because there's simply too many to read out. I encourage you to look in the chat and to look at some of these examples as well. Kelly also points out some states and territories already have sector strategies, either for the whole of state or the whole of sector, and there are strategic actions in place. Yeah, and that's great to remember as well, is like I mentioned earlier on, you might, depending on what intersection of volunteering that you're in, there may be multiple strategies in place or strategic objectives, and you can look for alignment between those or look around for which offers the most value for you to progress then and there. And it could, in fact, contribute to multiple strategies at the same time. So we really encourage you to look out for that alignment. This is absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing those. And please keep putting them in the chat, and please keep reaching out to us as well, because we're going to keep working with you and highlight these examples, because we want to celebrate your success and share case studies and practical examples of the national strategy in action. It's not very useful if it's only Volunteering Australia who learns about these. We are going to do our best to communicate these more broadly so that there can be linkages, strategic partnerships, examples, because one of the most amazing things about being involved in volunteering is how readily we help each other and assist each other, and how great it is to learn from each other. So there are lots of examples here in terms of people, individuals, organizations, some governments, using the national strategy in their work to progress their goals, to enhance their volunteer engagement, improve the volunteer experience, all these things that we've discussed. And that's happening now, but there will also be coordinated activity through action plans. So to bring us back to what we mentioned before, the establishment plan leads up to, the establishment phase, I should say, leads up to the first 3-year action plan. And so in the 3-year action plan, it'll be co-designed by the volunteering ecosystem in a similar process that led to the development of the national strategy. Those who participated in that co-design, I'm sure, will reflect on it well and see how their contributions shaped the national strategy. The 3-year action plan will also facilitate coordinated action where we can team up and all make sure we're working towards a common goal. It'll present opportunities for all members of the volunteering ecosystem to participate. So whether you're one of the larger volunteer involving organizations that may have access to more resources, whether you're within a level of government, whether you're an individual, there will be something in there in the action plan for you that presents an opportunity. There'll also be the impact of the 3-year action plan measured by a monitoring and evaluation framework that you might remember me mentioning before and is referenced in the National Strategy for Volunteering document. So we want to hear from you. So we will be opening expressions of interest for the establishment design team. So this will be a core group similar to the core design team during the development of the national strategy that will have an ongoing commitment and attendance at design sessions. We'll be opening up those expressions of interest soon. We currently have open expressions of interest for the National Strategy for Volunteering Council, which is the governance body. So some of you may have already expressed interest in that, or you may be considering both. Following this session, when we have the recording ready, we will send out an email with more information. So there'll be a recap of the session, and we'll be opening expressions of interest for the establishment design team. So please keep an eye on your inboxes. That should come next week. There will be ongoing opportunities to contribute through events, surveys, and consultations. One of the common themes within volunteering is that those who are heavily involved don't have a lot of extra time to contribute, and it might not suit your situation to have a regular participation in an ongoing team, such as the design team that I'm talking about here. We still want to hear from you. You have an important voice. You have an important role to contribute in the development of the first 3-year action plan. So there will be opportunities through one-off events, through surveys, through consultations, or you can just write to us, set up a one-on-one meeting, whatever works best for you, your voice will be heard. And like I mentioned before, you can contact us directly to share your thoughts as well. And so while we're thinking about this, I'd like to ask you, in an action plan, a 3-year action plan, what would you like to see? Of course, it might be early days to ask you this right now, but just kind of shooting from the hip, what actions would you imagine seeing that suit your role within the volunteering ecosystem, your experience, your plans for the future? What actions would you like to see in the 3-year action plan? And we'll present these as a word cloud. This will show us how many words we're using in common, how many words are different. We'll see this, but worth highlighting as well as individual responses that you submit here. We'll be able to have access to these later. So as I mentioned before, these will have ongoing this will form part of that ongoing consultation, along with the other things I mentioned before. So we've got some answers coming in here. That was fantastic. We got some things talking about local. Of course, most volunteering happens locally. All volunteering happens somewhere, and most of it happens within a local community, a suburb, a city, a town, a regional area, a community. And that's important to remember as well. So volunteering that happens at the national level, like through a national strategy, will be made up of many, many, many local parts. If you don't see the word cloud on your screen or you can't access it on the tab, please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. We'll see them there as well. Of course, there's no surprise that the biggest word right in the middle of here is volunteer. That's the key thing that we're talking about. Someone's put in the chat, strong support for the legal rights of volunteers. What else do we have here? Volunteer passport. Appreciation for those who volunteer, recognition, volunteer engagement, of course, recruitment and retention are key things in there. Someone's mentioned school curriculums and this idea of normalizing volunteering at a formative age, at a young age. That's when I got into volunteering myself, is when I was about 11 years old, volunteering on the Dalby Youth Council on Hoogie Festival, for anyone who is familiar with Dalby and Hoogie. So it's great responses coming in here, and we can see some core themes. And someone has mentioned like less formal types of volunteering as well, because of course, not all volunteering takes place formally through registered organizations. A lot of it happens less formally in ad hoc networks, ethnic communities, cultural groups, other forms of diverse volunteering or giving. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. We'll continue to collect information on this. And if you want to have a longer discussion with us or send us more, please get in touch. But like I said, we'll be rolling out more sessions where people can share their thoughts and co-design the first 3-year action plan. So as we come to the close of today's session, let's talk about what's coming up next throughout the rest of the establishment phase and in the near future. So there'll be the co-design of the first 3-year action plan through broad consultation, open-ended consultation where you can just share your thoughts, one-on-one meetings, or that establishment design team that I mentioned earlier, and looking for alignment with other strategic goals that exist within volunteering. Referencing before, one of the key asks within this session and also within other surveys we've done is for written guides, templates, practical resources. So we have some draft resources that we are progressing, and we'll be coming out with those as soon as we can to help bridge where people are currently now relative to the national strategy and where they'd like to be, to make sure that the national strategy is enhancing their work and saving them time. We have expressions of interest open for the National Strategy for Volunteering Council, the governance group, and we will be opening expressions of interest for the design team. So you'll see that in the email coming out with the recap of today's presentation and the recording. We are continuing to launch new research. So we're announcing a bit of a save the date here. We'll provide more information in an email, but we have had ongoing data releases from ANU. One you can look at that came out as part of the National Strategy for Volunteering was called the Volunteer Perspective as part of the Volunteering in Australia research. And there, at the end of the month, we'll be releasing with ANU the latest data on volunteer participation from their ongoing survey. So that'll be really interesting. We hope you can tune in for that one. And of course, working with you to share progress, to share examples, to share opportunities. And a key thing is, as DJ finished up, he said, please reach out to me, please get in touch. And I'm sure that many people who have given examples of the national strategy in action would say the same thing and would be happy to talk about it. And so we want to create those opportunities for partnerships and to share progress and celebrate the examples of the national strategy in action, like all the ones we heard today. We'll also be advocating for further support. Volunteering Australia releases a pre-budget submission each year for the federal budget, and we are currently in that process now, and discussions are happening now around what could be in there to advocate for further support for the national strategy for volunteering. And of course, you can subscribe to stay up to date. with future updates, future announcements, to make sure you see those events coming up, to make sure you get access to those resources when they're available. And what can you do? That might be what you're asking yourself here and now. You might have a clear idea. Maybe some of the examples served as inspiration for you. Maybe you already knew coming into this, you already had a game plan. Whatever your situation is, we'd like to guide you and help you. And so we've put together a little bit of a list here of some things that might be relevant for your situation. You could submit an expression of interest to those groups if you want to participate specifically in those teams. Contact us to share your ideas and stories. Browse the strategic objectives. That was a key thing that came from the example we highlighted from DJ and Uniting Care, Queensland. And it is the way that I would personally approach it in my engagement of volunteers would be to look at the strategic objectives first and to pick out those that best align with where we need to go in the future within our volunteer team. And the strategic objectives can help you set your volunteer goals. You can also build upon the National Strategy for Volunteering to strengthen applications, proposals, pitches, grant applications, especially if it's a body that's operating at the national level. You may want to communicate how your local impact feeds in to a national idea or a national strategy. And that was one of the key things we saw earlier in that word cloud. It's people talking about local. I even saw hyper-local. It's fantastic in your immediate adjacent neighborhood. That could be less formal volunteering, people helping each other, or guided through organizations as well. And so if you have a local impact, use the national strategy to serve as a framework to communicate that impact outside of the local area, how we're all participating within this national picture, this national strategy. And that goes on to that last point there as well. Use the national strategy to communicate your impact. This can be a tricky thing for some, is to consider how to measure and communicate impact of volunteering. We hope that the National Strategy for Volunteering serves as a ready-made tool, a ready-made framework for you to do just that, to highlight and recognize the contribution of volunteers. And of course, you can subscribe for updates. We encourage you to do so. And we asked many of you if you'd like to join our subscription list as well, because we want to be in touch. We want to hear from you, and we want to share those excellent examples with you. And so that brings us to the end of today's session. I really appreciate your time, your enthusiasm. Everyone was really quick on the buttons there for the polls. If you have thoughts now in the remaining minute, please put them in the chat. Please reach out to us. The email address and the website have been shared many times in the chat, and we really encourage you to get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to discuss this more with you. And if you put anything in the chat now, we'll reflect on this and look at this ahead of releasing more information in a follow-up email next week. So just to cap things off, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your support for the National Strategy for Volunteering, and we look forward to collaborating with you further throughout the establishment phase and beyond. Thank you.